At the present time, there are estimated to be perhaps as many as 1.7 billion people in the world who call themselves Christian, using the word Christian in its demographic sense, Catholics, Protestants included, and about 1.3 heading toward 1.4 billion people who are adherents of Islam. And it used to be that Muslims were out there in the Middle East and in the other parts of Southern Asia, and they were staying there. Islam was sort of static, stationary, but that has changed. And now there are millions and millions and millions of Muslims who are immigrating out of Muslim nations into Western Europe, into Canada, the USA, and Australia and New Zealand. A massive wave of immigration is happening, has been happening now for several decades. And Western nations welcomed the Muslim immigrants with open arms on the assumption that they would be like other immigrants from other nations, other cultures that over time assimilated to Western culture and would acknowledge the legal system of the nation they came to be a set of laws they could live by. But it's turning out, and more professors of demographics are recognizing that only a relatively small percentage of Muslims and their children coming into Western nations have assimilated to Western culture. A vast, very large majority are purposefully refusing to assimilate. Yes, they will learn English, they will learn French, they will learn German, they will learn the language, but they are rejecting the French, German, Australian, Canadian, American culture, and are holding to quite radical views based on the Koran, based on the Islamic religion, the writings in the Hadith. And it's also turning out that millions of them believe that Islam is bringing a set of laws, a new legal system called Sharia law. Please say Sharia law. S-H-A-R-I-A, pronounced Sharia. And they believe that Sharia law is far superior to the legal system of every Western nation, and ultimately must replace the constitution of every Western nation. So this means that Muslim demographics are a cause for grave concern to all of Western civilization. And gradually, nations are waking up and realizing we were naive in opening the gates for so many immigrants to come in who are purposefully designing to change our societies. And there are some things that should be changed in our societies. No society is perfect, and every society can be improved. But the kind of things that they regard as an improvement are things that Western people would regard as deepening into a disaster. Sharia law is extremely different from all Western legal systems, which are generally based upon the Judeo-Christian legal system in Old Testament law, the Ten Commandments especially. So that's a cause for grave concern, and that cause for grave concern is amplified awesomely by the fact that while they are immigrating and having lots and lots and lots of children, what are Western families increasingly doing? Having fewer and fewer and fewer children. Demographers are beginning to talk about the birth dearth. Please say that out loud. Birth dearth. Please add it to your vocabulary. Dearth, spelled D-E-A-R-T-H. I'm amazed how many people don't know that word in America. but I learned it in my school books in Canada. You all know about dearth, don't you? A scarcity, a lack of. You might say there's a dearth of wisdom in this committee. But there's a dearth of babies in all of Western civilization, including Japan. Japanese couples are having fewer and fewer babies. And as a result, the Japanese Department of Education in the last 10 years has closed 1,000 Japanese public schools. They just don't have Japanese children to put in them. Increasingly, Japanese school teachers are out of work. And all through Western Europe, the population of the French, the Germans, is diminishing. The percentage of population who are Muslim is increasing dramatically. Let me explain that demographers emphasize that for the population of a nation to remain constant, zero growth, but also zero loss, the average woman in the whole population has to have 2.11 babies. 2.11. That's just break even. All right, the average birth rate in Spain is 1.3. But it's even worse than that, because the 1.3 includes close to 1 million Muslim women in Spain who are having 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 children each. On purpose. The mullahs are urging them, have babies. Don't stop. Don't be like the Europeans. We want to have lots of Muslim babies because all the Muslim children born in this Western nation have the right to vote. And we're going to tell them how they're going to vote when it comes to some future election. So the goal is a takeover. So if you subtract the Muslim immigrant childbearing component out of the 1.3 in Spain, that leaves the average non-immigrant Spanish woman having 0.99 babies, something, it might be 1.01. So it's even worse than a 1.3 would suggest. The same figures apply to France. 1.5 birth rate, but far more Muslim women in France than there are in Spain, because much of North Africa is French-speaking, so it's Muslims more readily go to France maybe than to Spain. So Western Europe, like Japan, is going into negative population growth, which means there are fewer and fewer babies growing up and becoming adults and getting jobs and making payments into Social Security. So what does that mean long term? Social Security is going to run dry. So what do they have to do? Invite millions of immigrants to come in, hoping they'll get jobs and have deductions from their paychecks to keep Social Security afloat. But many of those immigrants coming in from North Africa and other Muslim countries purposefully do not get jobs. They go on the dole. They're welcome, they're here, and it's a big hullabaloo if you have to deport them. So they just live on Western European charity, which makes the financial situation even worse. And it's happening in England. So the Muslims tried to take over all of Christian Europe back in the 700s by military force. They had already conquered Spain and Portugal. They invaded France, and they were advancing northward. They got as far as a city called Tours, T-O-U-R-S. And if they'd taken all of France, they would have invaded Germany. They would have crossed the English Channel, attacked England. And it seemed they were unstoppable. But Charles Martel, a Frankish general with an army, stopped their advance at the Battle of Tours. They were defeated and eventually driven out of France, but they still kept control of Spain and Portugal until 1492, the year Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Finally, then they were driven out of France and Portugal, but they still kept control of all of what had been mainly Christian North Africa. where Augustine lived. And there were churches and seminaries across there, and they remained engulfed by Islam. So we live in a day of unprecedented demographic change. And Gaddafi, the head of the Muslim nation Libya, has stated, you can hear him saying it on television, he said, Islam is going to take over all of Europe, and we're not going to need bombs and guns and terrorist attacks to do it. He said 50 million Muslims are living in Europe, and now suddenly it's 52 million. He said they're going to take over. All of Europe will be Islamic within a few years, and we're not going to have to fire any bullets, drop any bombs to do it. So what Muslims could not do back in the 700s by military invasion, they are now accomplishing just by procreation. And what do you suppose it is that is causing millions and millions, hundreds of millions of married couples in Western nations, including Japan, which you normally wouldn't think of as a Western nation, but in terms of its technology it is. What is discouraging people from having babies the way they used to? My mother was number 9 of 13. And I was one of 7 pregnancies, 3 of which didn't succeed, so I'm the oldest of 4 children, but there were 3 other pregnancies my mother had. My first wife and I had 5 pregnancies, 1 ended in miscarriage, but we raised 4 children. We were planning on raising 5. But ever so many people are saying, oh, that's not cool. In fact, we stayed in a home in Oxford in the South Island just a few days ago, and Chris Donaldson, the head of YWAM at that base, and his wife Suzanne said they had a young couple come as students to the YWAM base there a few years ago from Switzerland. And they proudly announced, we are willing not to have babies because we don't want to overpopulate the world, and it would be unfair to have too many children that would deny other people their resources. And Chris and Suzanne took quite a while to persuade them. You've been misled by your liberal college professors back in Switzerland. That is not a problem. And what is the first command in the Bible? Be fruitful and multiply. Don't subtract, don't divide, multiply. And how many pastors are preaching that command nowadays? None that I know of. It's like everybody assumes there's a natural human instinct to want to have children, want to get married and have a family. And I'm sure there is. But it's proving, history is proving that that natural human instinct is quite easily overwhelmed by cultural pressures, cultural influences. So we've got 4 main things that are contributing to demographic suicide in all of Western civilization. And one is high abortion rates. I'm sure if you could go back in time and talk to the judges who made abortion legal in the United States of America in the Roe versus Wade case, or the judges in other nations who made abortion legal, if you would say, aren't you afraid that this law that you've passed will contribute ultimately to the self-genocide, the extinction of the human race? I think every one of those justices would have said, no, 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 that won't happen, because people just naturally want to have babies. Abortion rates won't get astronomically high. It will not be a threat to the existence of the human race. But if those justices are still alive now, I wonder if they're rethinking. Or are they just living in their gate-guarded communities, watching television and ignoring what's happening? Who knows? They may all be dead. But it is grim. 50 million babies have been aborted in the United States of America since 1973. And now we're wondering why we have an economic recession. Well, guess what one reason is? Those 50 million babies would all be purchasing adults by now. And they would have all had children by now that would also be purchasing adults. So the whole economy is counting on increased population, an increasing number of purchasers of whatever. But the justice system and the educational system is teaching and influencing counter to population growth, contrary to it. So those millions and millions of people are not there to buy houses. They're not there buying refrigerators and cars. We've undercut the whole economy ourselves by our own legal system and our silly, reckless education system that is so liberal it can't think straight. And it goes around the world. People have got to start thinking differently. Unless the Lord comes quickly, the consequences are dire indeed. So, should we learn something more about Islam than we already know? Are you eager to learn? Good, because I'm eager to teach. So, I want to talk about the Koran. And I'm going to ask the question, are we to believe Muslims who declare that the Koran is a profound piece of literature, inspired by Almighty God, the most awesome thing that has ever been printed on the face of this world, or not? Muslims do make lofty claims for the Quran. For example, Muslims are being taught that the Quran existed in heaven from eternity. Before the universe was created, the Quran was there. Before there was any finite being to read the Quran, it was already written in Arabic in heaven. Paralleling John chapter 1 verse 14 in the Gospel of John, where we read that Jesus is the Word made flesh. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Muslims are saying the Quran is the Word made book, which is virtually a deification of a book. Though Muhammad, in 4 verses in the Quran, admits that he was illiterate, he calls himself an unlettered prophet 4 times. Muslims claim that divine inspiration compensated for his personal illiteracy. And the Quran is awesome, it is breathtaking, it is so inspiring, despite the fact that its human author was an illiterate man. The opening verse of chapter 2 in the Quran, which is the longest chapter in the Quran, forbids everyone who reads it to doubt the claims that the Quran makes for itself. The opening verse of chapter 2 is, I quote, "This is a revelation from God not to be doubted." So there's no "come let us reason together" in the Quran. Bring your critical faculties to examine the Quran, and the Quran will persuade you, no matter how skeptical you are, that it is profound. No, you're not invited to bring any criticism to it, to examine it at all. You're just supposed to accept it, that it's from God and has to be taken as such. So Muslims never jot notes in a copy of the Quran, never underline one verse in it. It is the first thing a devout Muslim family brings into a new home, and it must occupy the highest shelf in the house. Yet even casual readers find numerous stylistic flaws in the Quran. For example, the Quran is astonishingly repetitious. Muhammad tells the Old Testament's Exodus story, Israel coming out of Egypt, heading for the Promised Land. He knew something about that story, listening to Jews talk about it. And it must have been one of his favorite pulpit pieces, because he tells the Exodus story 27 times in the first 89 chapters of the Quran. Same story, 27 times in 89 chapters. That's the same story once in every 3.3 chapters. So it makes you wonder if after angels were created, they were the only finite beings to read the Quran. What are we to think of the IQ of angels if they had to have the same story repeated once every 3.3 chapters for 89 chapters? Seems as strange evidence for inspiration from an omniscient being. Not only that, Muhammad tells the story of Noah and the flood 28 times in the first 71 chapters. Divide 28 and 71, you got the same story once in every 2.5 chapters. And it goes on and on and on. He tells the story of Abraham 24 times in the first 87 chapters. And there are dozens of other stories that Muhammad tells at least a dozen times in the Quran. So I did a check and found out if all the stories, and we're talking about stories, not proverbs that might be repeated, stories, if all the stories, the biographical accounts that are repeated in the Quran were each told just once, that alone would reduce the length of the Quran by 45%. So 45% of the Quran is telling you stories that are already in the other 55%. And what is the effect on the human brain? You and I are reading the Quran, and you're constantly reading what you've already read, and stories are not the only thing that are repeated enormously. The repetition gets to you. Your brain starts complaining, what have I done to you that you're punishing me with this? And as a result, everyone who starts reading the Quran starts reading, but you keep going, boredom sets in, and reading gives way to browsing, and browsing eventually gives way to skimming. And all kinds of people who say they've read the Quran, and when I start listening to them talk about it, or I ask them questions about it, I quickly find out they think they've read it, but they've actually just skimmed it. And that includes some scholars who have written books about Islam. They have overlooked things that are in the Quran because they're scholars, why would they overlook something? Well, they're susceptible to boredom too. And it was happening to me. I was reading it and I found, my mind is drifting, I'm just starting to skim. What if I miss something that's important? So I prayed and said, Lord, this is so absolutely, utterly boring, but I've got to stay focused if I'm going to write a well-researched book about it. How can I stay focused in spite of the boredom? And God is so faithful. It's like an answer suddenly was right inside my head. The answer was, you notice the repetitions? I said, oh, yes. That's it then. Dedicate yourself to count the repetitions. Just count the repetitions. That'll keep you focused to turn another page, just to see how many more repetitions of this, that, and the other thing you can find. And in the process, you will find things you would otherwise overlook. And it worked. I endured the boredom so you won't have to, unless you want to. It is boring. Okay, that's not all. If you would say to a Muslim, you know, I notice the Quran is extremely repetitious, and say it politely, the Muslim may react by saying, well, I've heard the repetitions in your Bible too. Aren't there some stories told in more than one of the Gospels? And you will say, yes, but that's 4 different writers giving mutually confirming accounts of what happened from 4 different sources. That's not the same as one source repeating just to compensate for his lack of wider intellectual horizons. Same thing, any stories that are repeated in the Samuel books, the King books, or the Chronicle books in the Old Testament, 3 different authors giving mutually confirming accounts of what happened. That's not the same as one author, just repeating himself astonishingly. All right, that's not all that's repeated. When I was reading chapter 2 in the Quran, by the way, the chapters of the Quran, with the exception of chapter 1 and a few others, it starts with the longest chapter up front, that's chapter 2, and then they generally diminish each successive chapter a few verses shorter till you get to chapter 114, which is only about 8 verses. So that's a rather strange way for determining the order of chapters, isn't it? Just count the number of verses, and that decides where a chapter goes. And it's not chronological at all. It's not like the chapters of Matthew where the same story continues and you're following a consistent chronological flow of events. It's just a mishmash of chapters. How are we going to arrange them? Okay, let's put them like this. Let's put the longest one first and all the others are successively shorter. But in chapter 2, I noticed about once in every 8 verses, Muhammad is threatening readers of the Quran with hellfire. Unless they're going to burn in hell, he says again and again, you're going to be inmates of the flame. You're going to be forced to drink boiling water. Then he gets, that isn't enough. You're going to be forced to drink molten metal. And 4 times in the Quran, he describes people in hell. Allah uses the flame to singe away the entire surface area of their skin. and then he renews their skin to be singed away in the flame again and again and again, presumably forever. So I said, 1 out of 8 verses all through chapter 2, he's emphasizing hell. Wow. Can hardly wait to get into chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, all the other chapters, see which other strings he has to pluck on his harp. But guess what? Chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, same thing. Same thing. And I thought, and here's how you can check this. You can go on a search engine like google.com or whatever, and just type in the word Quran, hit enter, and you'll have maybe a dozen websites that enable you to get the entire text of the Quran right on your computer screen. Choose one that allows you to do a word search. And just type in the name Moses, hit enter, and you'll see the name Moses in bold letters in every chapter where the Exodus story is told. And you can go through and count, see how much that same story is repeated. Just type in the name Abraham, hit enter, you'll see the same thing. Well, just type in the word hell, hit enter, and you will get a majority of 783 verses that threaten readers of the Quran with hellfire if they worship idols, if they refuse to acknowledge Muhammad as a prophet, if they doubt the Quran, if they do not submit to Islamic rule. Hell, 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 hell. Divide 783 into 6,200, which is the total number of verses in the 114 chapters. 1 out of every 8 verses consistently is threatening you with hellfire. So that's another thing that's repeated enormously. I did a check through the New Testament to find out how many verses in the New Testament warn us of God's judgment. And it's 1 verse out of 120, according to my survey. 1 verse out of 120. Verses like Hebrews 9:27, for example, it is, "For man wants to die, and after death, the judgment. And is it valid to warn people that God is the judge and judgment will be convened? Everything that is done in secret will be made open. Anything that is not covered by the blood of Christ will be dealt with at the judgment seat of Christ, and other things dealt with at the great white throne. Mankind needs to be warned. God is the judge, and he means business. Sin is a serious matter." But Muhammad saw that this valid doctrine of the New Testament was something he could exploit for other reasons, which would be to thoroughly terrify his followers into total submission to him, lest they end up in that hell, and to use the threat of hellfire to cow enemies into stopping their criticism of him. So it's exploited. And the reason I mention this, because when we're dealing with Muslims, if they have read the Quran, which is relatively rare for Muslims, then you know that they are afraid of hellfire. It is so strongly emphasized that hell is there and it's a doom, and God is very eager to cast as many people in there as he possibly can, especially women. Why did I say that? What I'm going to tell you next is not from the Quran, but from the Hadith. Say Hadith. Hadith. In Arabic, in Farsi, the language of Iran, which is predominantly Shia Muslim, it's Hadis, because apparently Farsi doesn't have the TH sound. All right? In the Hadith, Muhammad declared that Allah granted him a vision of hell, and he looked out this ocean of fire and saw millions of people writhing, screaming, suffering in the flames. He looked closely and saw, why, there's more women down there than men. So he asked Allah, why are there more women suffering in hell than men? And Allah's answer, according to Muhammad in the Hadith, was, it's because women are so unappreciative of all the wonderful things their husbands do for them. Why would he say something like that? Obviously, he was just giving that to Muslim men, something they think is inspired by God, to use as a club to browbeat Muslim women into total submission, to suffocate their freedom of speech, their ability to think independently. And that's just one of many, many examples. In the Quran, Muhammad authorizes Muslim men to beat their wives if they are really stubborn. You can actually beat them. And he says other things about Muslim women, women who are slaves of Muslim men. Okay, continuing on down, examining the Quran. Along with all these other flaws, the extreme repetition. Oh, something else that is repeated in the Quran is jihad verses. I counted them. At the back of Secrets of the Quran, I have several appendixes, and one is an appendix giving you the references in the Quran for every war verse called a jihad verse. A verse calling Muslims to be prepared, equipped and ready for holy war against infidels. And it's 109. Divide 109 into 6,200, you find that 1 out of 55 verses in the Quran was recited by Muhammad, not written by him because he was illiterate, but recited by him to urge his followers to be ready for violence against infidels. And some of the war verses authorized Muslims to behead us. So when you hear of terrorists capturing a hostage and beheading him, you know that they understand they have authorization from the Quran to do that. In chapter 8, along with authorizing beheading infidels like us, there's also permission is given to torture us by cutting off our fingertips. They are authorized to ambush us, to tax us heavily with a tax called jizya. Please say jizya. That is a special tax that Sharia law authorizes Muslim rulers to impose upon infidels who would be killed if they don't submit to Islamic rule, but if they totally submit, say, yes, okay, we give in, let Sharia law prevail, we'll never say a word against Muhammad, we'll never speak against Islam, we'll never say anything to discredit the Quran, we totally submit, then they can be allowed to live in a Muslim society, but they're called dhimmis, D-H-I-M-M-I, and dhimmis are subject to the jizya tax, which can be any tax rate the Muslim caliph or sultan decides he wants to impose. Muslims pay at 2.5%. Other people can be charged whatever percent. And Sharia law authorizes Muslims tax collectors, and this was done for centuries in the Muslim world, wherever there were Jews and Christians, to go out and demand the percentage of tax required by Sharia law. And if a Jew or a Christian could not pay the tax, the Muslim tax collector was authorized to say, how many children do you have? This many. All right, since you cannot pay your tax, we're going to take one son and one daughter from you. That'll be the payment for your tax. Kidnapping Jewish and Christian children from their families is authorized by Sharia law. And I was watching on a documentary on television, documentary about Islam, and a Muslim woman who is a professor in a university somewhere in the Western world was talking about this practice of kidnapping Christian and Jewish children. And the question was, what did the Muslims do with the children? Well, the Christian and Jewish girls would become sex slaves for a Muslim nobleman in his harem, where, of course, polygamy is fully authorized in the Quran. And the young Christian boys, especially the Christian boys, would be trained as Muslim soldiers. They'd all be force converted to Islam, little children, they wouldn't have much resistance. But Christian boys were especially selected to be trained as what were called janissaries. What did janissaries do? They were the personal guardians of the Sultan in his palace. Now, why did they want to have boys stolen from Christian families to be special bodyguards trained in military arts to protect the Muslim ruler? She said it was because Muslims found they couldn't trust Muslim bodyguards because they would have connections with somebody else somewhere who would bribe them or pay them, kill the Sultan because he imposed a tax on us or he invaded us or he wouldn't do something for us, wouldn't build a highway or a bridge or whatever. So they found they just couldn't trust Muslim bodyguards, but Christian children having something of the Christian ethic were more trustworthy. So they made them janissaries, and they would, at the cost of their lives, they were just indoctrinated to the point they got to protect the Sultan or the Caliph, whichever he was called. So these war verses are all through, and that's another thing that's repeated. Something else that's a problem for readers of the Quran is Muhammad. Apparently no one ever told Muhammad, you should never use a pronoun like they, them, it, she, he, her, unless somewhere close to the pronoun you provide the noun that pronoun represents. Didn't bother him that he was using all kinds of pronouns and doesn't supply the nouns. So you're constantly reading, he's talking about someone by way of a pronoun, and you're asking, who was that? Who's he talking about? You don't know. You're constantly reading back a few verses to see if you missed something, or reading on ahead a few verses to see if something, the explanation comes later. It isn't there. For example, in chapter 8, verse 18, Muhammad says, if you were expecting a judgment, now is a judgment come down for you. But if you desist, it would be so much better for you. So you're asking, who did he say that to? Who was that counsel for? You don't know. And what was the judgment that came to them? The one they were seeking, or a different judgment? You don't know. What were they supposed to desist from? Seeking a judgment or something else? You don't know. All kinds of questions are left unanswered. What effect does that have on your brain? Your brain gets weary. This is not logical. This does not make sense. This does not show any sign of being inspired by God. Plus, there are a lot of scientific mistakes. Muhammad defined shooting stars, meteorites, as demons being cast out of heaven. Well, all sorts of things. Not only that, but Muhammad abused classical Arabic both grammatically and lexically. He used the wrong words. He used the wrong rules of grammar in Arabic. How do we know that? Years ago, archaeologists, I should say, in Yemen, the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula, found the ruins of a city that had been abandoned about 1,000 years earlier, and there was a mosque in that abandoned city. So they thought, you know, whenever a copy of the Koran got tattered and too old to use anymore, they would not throw it in a garbage can. They would not throw it in the fire. A copy of the Quran that was too old to be used, the pages were starting to come apart, they would bury it with honors in a special little hollow place in the wall of the mosque. Like it was a person. Had to be, you know, the remains of it had to be buried. So they said, if we check the walls of this old abandoned mosque, we may find a really ancient copy of the Quran. And they did. They found it. This was the oldest copy of the Quran, more than 1,000 years old. And they said, we need a learned scholar to study this, analyze it, and write academic papers about it. Who did they hire? They did not hire a Muslim scholar. They hired a German professor of classical Arabic named Gerd Puin, P-U-I-N, however that's pronounced in German. He got the job. He read it. So the fact that a Muslim nation would hire him, a German, to do that study is an indication they believe in his scholarliness, they believe in his expertise. I have quotes in Secrets of the Quran from him, in which he says, when you're reading the Quran in Arabic, the original language, which, you know, if you mention to a Muslim about the Quran is boring, it's repetitious, or it uses a lot of pronouns and doesn't give us the nouns, and I get confused, a Muslim will say, it's because you're reading it in an inferior language like English or French or German. If you were reading it in Arabic, the repetition wouldn't be boring, the war verses wouldn't be frightening. You would be so impressed, you would be awestruck if you could only read it in Arabic, but unfortunately you can't read it in Arabic. Well, Gerd R. Puin can read it in Arabic, and he says 20% of the text of the Quran in Arabic is bad grammar, or the wrong words are used. It is not good Arabic at all. And it's like a friend of mine was teaching a Wednesday evening Bible study, in a home group, and he must have had a hard day because we all suddenly heard him say, there are devious ways we can serve God. What do you mean to say? There are diverse ways we can serve God. But somehow devious got in there instead of diverse. And he didn't even realize his mistake, and we just kind of smiled at each other and let him continue teaching because we knew what he meant to say. But it's there, again and again, Muhammad just uses the wrong Arabic word. He didn't know he was using the wrong Arabic word. And he abuses Arab grammar in the Quran. So the Quran is not any better in Arabic than it is in any other translation. In fact, Gerard Pouin goes on to say that he believes the reason Arabic-speaking custodians of the Quran in Saudi Arabia refused for centuries to give their consent for the Quran to be translated even into other languages of the Muslim world, like Farsi, Urdu. They didn't want to translate it. It has to be in Arabic. They didn't want to translate it into French and German. He suggests the reason they wanted it to be kept in Arabic because if it was translated into other languages and the translators were honest, what was gibberish in Arabic should also be gibberish in Urdu if they're honest translators, right? And so they thought that will let the cat out of the bag. Everybody will see this is an awful misrepresentation of anything that could be inspired by God. It's a mess. So they wanted to protect the Quran from criticism by just keeping it in Arabic and hoping that Arabic-speaking readers wouldn't let the cat out of the bag. They'd probably say, no, we're obligated to honor it, so we won't let anybody know how it reads to us. In fact, a lot of Muslims don't read the Quran. You ask the average Muslim, have you read the Quran? The most common answer you will get is, no, I haven't read it, but we all know what's in it. They think they know what's in it. They really, just like Jews who don't read the Torah, they read commentaries on it, they think they know what's in it. They don't know how much they're missing. So, and I think one reason why a lot of Muslims do not read the Quran is because they're reading and they experience boredom too. And then they also read something else that recurs again and again, warnings, Allah knows what you're thinking, Allah knows what's in your heart. So if they're bored and they are constantly reminded, Allah sees what's in my heart, that He sees I'm bored with this holy book, and He may throw me into hell because I was bored when I was supposed to feel inspired. But the more I read, the more bored I get. So if I'm going to be thrown into hell for being bored by the Quran, maybe I better just stop reading it because I can't be punished I can't be bored by what I haven't read. So not reading it is like a psychological defense mechanism for feeling guilty because you're bored by it. Well, that's my theory about why so few of them read it. But there are others who do read it. And no matter what, they're endorsing what it says and accepting what it says as from God. And that is the source of real radicalism. We'll say more about that later. Now, another problem with the Quran is that in it we find whatever Muhammad downloaded from Old Testament scripture into the Quran, whatever he borrowed from New Testament scripture, is virused. It's not, people say Muhammad borrowed. Well, if you're borrowing something, you may abridge it, you may paraphrase it, but if you change the content drastically, can that be called borrowing? No. That is like plagiarism. That is like virusing someone else's text. And here are some examples of Old Testament content that got really virused in the process of Muhammad downloading it, so to speak, from Old Testament scripture into his fraudulent book. Muhammad, in his recurring tellings of the Exodus story, leaves something out. Now let me ask you, in the Exodus story, what is the most important event without which there would not have been an Exodus? The Passover sacrifice. The Passover sacrifice is the beating heart of the Exodus story. Guess what? The Passover sacrifice is not mentioned, not even once in 27 tellings of the Exodus story. Is that an Exodus story or a virused simile of it? It's virused up. And that is an example of how vehemently Muhammad, or the spirit that was in him, was opposed to the whole doctrine of the atonement. He must have known that Christians talked about Jesus as their Passover lamb. He denied the Passover. All right, so that's one example of virusing. And here's something else. 4 times in his telling of the Exodus story, he quotes Pharaoh in Egypt in the days of Moses, requiring Haman from the book of Esther to build a tower of bricks up to heaven. 4 different Old Testament stories mixed into one. That's virusing. In 4 of the Exodus accounts, he has God showing his anger against the Jews camped at the foot of Mount Sinai by lifting the entire mass of Mount Sinai right up in the sky and holding it above the camp of Israel. And the people looked up and said, if we don't promise to obey all his laws, he's going to drop Mount Sinai on us. So they all began saying, okay, we'll obey all your laws. Please put Mount Sinai back down on the earth. And he did. That's told 4 times. As if that was part of the Exodus story. Does that sound virused or what? Terribly, terribly changed. And there are other things like that that turned out to be Jewish bedtime fables that he thought were scripture. And there's a theory about how those strange stories got mixed in with semi-scriptural accounts. And it makes sense. I think it's the most logical explanation for some of these really odd things that are in there. The theory says, well, actually the first part is not theory. We know that when Muhammad in the city of Mecca, his hometown, was beginning to proclaim himself as a prophet, he said, the same God who sent Moses to the Jews and Jesus to the Christians is sending me to you. And so this was his proclamation, with no miracles, just him saying it. So a lot of pagans said, how do we know that's true? We don't. If you want us to believe that you are a prophet sent to us by the same God who commissioned Moses to the Jews and Jesus to the Christians, we need a second opinion on you, sir. Here's what you have to do. There are no Jews resident here in Mecca, no synagogue. Any Jews who were in Mecca were caravanning from the north to the south or from the south to the north, staying in Mecca overnight. Well, actually, no, they stayed by day because they caravanned at night when it was cool and slept in some caravan stop like Mecca during the hot hours of the day. So the Jews in Mecca were asleep, not there exactly ready to talk about theology with someone like Muhammad. But they said, you have to go to Medina. There's a significant community of learned Jews in Medina. Go and preach to them, Mr. Muhammad, and if they affirm that you are indeed a prophet, that their God was sent to people like us, that will carry weight with us. But we need a second opinion, and it has to come from the Jews up there in Medina. So with the passage of time, Muhammad felt an increasing desire to go to Medina, present himself and his message to the Jews, hoping to win an intellectual affirmation from them. Because if the Jews said to the pagans, he's right, he is a prophet, we endorse him, believe him, that would make an incredible difference. It would have a profound effect on large numbers of pagans, and the new Islamic movement would gain force rapidly. So he was planning. Muslims will say he only left Mecca because he was driven out by the persecution. It was more than that. There was some persecution. But he needed to go to Mecca, to Medina rather, to try to win an intellectual affirmation from the Jews, because this would be a second opinion endorsing his own personal claim about his own calling. But he knew he really didn't know the scriptures. There was no synagogue in Mecca. So he had to get some more information about the Jewish scriptures from some other source. So here's where the theory part begins. He found out there was another Jewish community in a different direction from Mecca. He went secretly to that Jewish community and said, I'm a pagan, but I want to learn about Judaism. Please teach me what's in your scriptures. So they did. They thought, that's great. We'd love to teach you. So they taught him various Old Testament stories. But then he came back to Mecca and preached those stories, claiming he got them directly from the angel Gabriel. Because he always claimed, Allah sent the angel Gabriel to recite to me what's in the Koran up in heaven. And that's why I was getting transmitted to mankind here on earth. So he was fraudulently pumping the Jews for information about the Torah and then claiming he got it supernaturally from God via an angel. The theory says the Jews in that community found out what he was doing. They said, so that's it, is it? Wait till he comes again. So went back again for more information that he could use fraudulently. But they were onto him, and they began purposefully giving him Jewish bedtime stories because they knew he wouldn't know the difference. The intention being, when he preached those stories, he would be exposed as a fraud. Everybody said, that is not in the scriptures. You didn't get that from Gabriel. No way. So that's how these strange Jewish bedtime stories and fables got into the Quran. He didn't know the difference. The Jews set him up. And that would be one reason why he began to hate the Jews with a vehement hatred. But you see, he didn't know until he got to Medina that they had set him up that much. Because when he was preaching in Mecca, nobody knew the difference, right? Okay. But finally he left Mecca, went about nearly 300 kilometers north to a city called Medina. And on the way to Medina, Muhammad said to his 70 or so followers, when we get to Medina, we're all going to prostrate ourselves 3 times a day on the ground and pray toward Jerusalem. Why were they going to do that? This was supposed to impress the Jews, that he really was a man they could acknowledge as a prophet. It was like a carrot on a stick. So sure enough, they came to Medina, and they were prostrating themselves 3 times a day, praying toward Jerusalem, with the Jews watching. And then he approached the Jews, and they'd already heard about him. They knew he was a man down in Mecca proclaiming himself as a prophet. So they were curious about him. They met with him, and he said to the Jewish rabbis, listen to this and then tell me which part of what he said the Jews would not accept. The same God who sent Moses to you and Jesus to the Christians is sending me to the Arabs. Which part of that did he have no idea the Jews would not accept? The fact that he was saying their God sent Jesus to the... He didn't know the Jews did not acknowledge Jesus. That's how naive he was. So he put his foot in his mouth right from the beginning in presenting himself to the Jews, and the indications are that when the Jews heard him say that, some of them said to him, don't talk to us about Jesus, we crucified him. And he didn't know about the crucifixion. So when the Jews said that in front of his followers, he was surprised, and all his followers surprised. So his followers are thinking, what? Wait a minute, Gabriel didn't tell you about that? Hey, come on, what's going on here? So it was a moment of dire embarrassment. And he had to somehow say something that would ease the terrible embarrassment of this sudden statement from the Jews that just shocked him. So what did he say? He said, you thought you crucified him. It was made so to appear to you. In other words, God deceived you. You thought you were crucifying Jesus. It was mistaken identity. It was someone else. Jesus wasn't there to be crucified because Allah took him up into heaven so you couldn't crucify him. That's in chapter 4 in the Quran, the denial of the crucifixion of Jesus. Something he blurted out when he was taken by surprise, became doctrine. Just an attempt to save face. So, Not only is the Passover sacrifice not mentioned in the Koran in 27 tellings, but the crucifixion of our Lord is denied. Things are getting virused, aren't they? Sadly. Well, the Jews refused to acknowledge him as a prophet, but I found evidence that at least some of the Jews wanted to show him goodwill. They knew he was in no way to be acknowledged as a prophet. They refused to give their intellectual affirmation. But apparently they recognized he had leadership ability, he was intelligent, he had charisma, whatever, influence, ability to influence people. So that they decided to try to ease his disappointment in their refusing to acknowledge him as a prophet by offering him an alternative to being a prophet, which was, they said, here in the city of Medina, we frequently have severe disagreements and we need an impartial person to be an arbitrator of our disagreements. And it's hard to find a citizen of Medina to be an impartial arbitrator because everybody's on everybody's side, somehow. But you're a man from a completely different city. Would you agree to be appointed by us as an official arbitrator of disputes? Just like Solomon arbitrated things as a king, you can be an arbitrator of disputes. And you'll get paid for each arbitration. Well, this was to enable him to have some means of self-support in a city where he otherwise would have to get a job of some kind. So he accepted. And the Jews agreed to appoint him as an arbitrator. They didn't have to do that. They could have just ignored him and hope he'd just go away. But the fact that they agreed to that, and Muslim apologists make much of that, they call the appointment of Muhammad as an arbitrator of disputes in Medina as what they call the Constitution of Medina. It was not that. That's aggrandizing it to say it was a constitution, but anyway, that's what they call it. You'll hear about that if you read up on what Muslim apologists say in defense of Muhammad. So he was arbitrating disputes, but he bitterly resented the fact that the Jews from that other community where he was getting wrong information purposefully given to him had tricked him, and bitterly resented the fact that the Jews in Medina refused to acknowledge him as a prophet. They said, prophets work miracles. If you really want an endorsement as a prophet, work a miracle, sir. Make an axe head float in the water, whatever. He couldn't work miracles. 4 verses in the Quran show Muhammad complaining about people demanding miracles, as if, why should that be necessary? So when he finally became convinced that there was no way the Jews would acknowledge him as a prophet, his whole attitude toward them changed. Bitterness rose up and replaced his original interest in reaching out and getting some kind of understanding with the Jews. And about that time, he decided if the Jews are that resistant to my claims, Christians will be as well. There were no Christians there. There's no mention of any interaction with Christians at all. Should there have been? Should there have been churches? If centuries before that, even back by the 300s, Christians had gone all the way from Jerusalem to Ireland, couldn't they have gone a few hundred miles south into the Arab Peninsula and planted churches there? They hadn't. It was a fault of the church in ignoring, changing the teaching agenda, leaving that part of the world without a witness that could easily have been there. And it might have spared the world from Islam. People would have been able, maybe Muhammad would have become an evangelist, who knows? Well, so something else in the Quran that is virus. Muhammad tells the story of Gideon selecting a smaller number of warriors according to how they drank water. In the Quran, it isn't Gideon, it's King Saul. Talking about Jesus in the Quran, what little he knew about him, He acknowledges the virgin birth of Jesus, calls him the Son of Mary, no mention of a human father. He even said God sent his Spirit to cause Mary to become pregnant with Jesus. And yet, they deny the deity of Jesus. I mean, if it was God's Spirit that caused him to be born supernaturally, that's almost acknowledging his deity. But no, he denies the deity. He's only a prophet. And he acknowledges Jesus as a miracle worker, denies his atoning death and his resurrection. So he says nice things about Jesus, but denies the most important thing. And so that's where his borrowings from the New Testament are virus. Now, in the Hadith, something else is virus, the second coming of our Lord. Muhammad found out about the second coming, and in the Hadith, there are passages where he says Jesus is coming back to judge the world. And I read something by a Christian missiologist saying, Muhammad said Jesus is coming back to judge the world. Isn't that great? We can use that. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. You don't know the whole story, sir, if you think we can use that. Here's how it goes in the Hadith. Yes, Jesus is coming back to judge the world, but the first thing he says in that judgment is to command all the Jews and all the Christians of the world to reject Christianity, reject Judaism, and convert immediately to Islam. That's judgment number one. And in spite of the fact that Jesus himself is urging Jews and Christians to convert to Islam immediately, millions will refuse in spite of commanded by him. So seeing our refusal to convert to Islam at his command, Jesus will authorize faithful Muslims to take their weapons and go all through the world, slaughtering all the Jews and Christians that refuse his command to convert to Islam. And Christians and Jews will be hiding behind rocks and trees because Muslims are searching for them. But hiding behind rocks and trees, according to the Hadith, will not spare us from slaughter, because Jesus will supernaturally cause rocks and trees to grow a mouth, and the mouth on the side of a rock will call, "O faithful Muslims, there's a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him." A tree will grow a mouth and call, "O faithful Muslims, there's a Christian hiding behind me, come and kill him." So we'll all be slaughtered. And then Jesus will marry 6 virgins and settle down to live out the rest of his life, which was interrupted by his being taken up into heaven to avoid being crucified by the Jews and the Romans. Does that sound like a virus eschatology? And so it goes. Well, these are the realities. And this is the religion that is propagating itself, and Muslims are having enormously more babies, and they're keeping them in Muslim schools where they're indoctrinated. And what does this mean for us as Christians in this day and age? Are we at the beginning of a major all-out struggle? Yes. Because they're free to use the sword. They're not using it. They can use just procreation rates instead of violence, but eventually the day will come when every nation in Western Europe will have a large enough block of Muslims voting as a bloc, to vote into power a party that they know will appoint a Muslim prime minister, who will appoint Muslim cabinet members and Muslim generals in charge of the armed forces. And that will be a dire moment in history. It's, do the math, unless the Lord comes back or something else totally unexpected, and that could be, I'm not saying that what I'm describing is inevitable. The Lord may come back, or other things that we have no inkling of now may happen, but apart from that, England is going to be a Muslim nation. So will France and Italy. Hey, in Italy, the showpiece of Roman Catholicism, the birth rate is the lowest in all of Europe. Even though Catholicism opposes abortion, Catholics are aborting babies massively. And I mentioned earlier 4 things that are reducing our birth rates catastrophically. I mentioned abortion. Another thing is high divorce rates. Ever so many marriages are interrupted by casual divorce before one or two babies are born. And if the divorced woman doesn't remarry, she may be out of the childbearing picture permanently. And here's another thing: unduly high use of birth control. Millions of people who would never abort a pregnancy are practicing excessive birth control. And what reasons might they have for it? We both need to work, so can't have babies. Or, I see other people's children, when they're little, they say, "I love you, Daddy, I love you, Mommy." Then they get to be teenagers, they turn into world-weary cynics and turn against their parents and are insolent and sassy and disobedient. Why do I want to have children that'll be nice for a few years and then turn against me? I don't want to pay their college expenses. Let somebody else have teenage brats that are going to be insolent. Maybe that's part of it. I said that once with a whole bunch of teenagers on one side of the church, and I said, "Present company excluded, but make sure you are not like that." And they were all smiling and grinning. Most of them were homeschool children. Yeah. So, what else? A fourth thing: an insane popularization of homosexuality. Here we're talking about a reason for not being in favor of homosexuality that's outside of Scripture. And what is that? Homosexuality, by its very nature, is pro-extinction. If it gets spread wide enough, far enough, eventually it will reach a critical mass beyond which the extinction of the human race is inevitable. And yet, what do we have? Our educators are supposed to be wise, aren't they? They're promoting homosexuality. Little children in elementary schools are being taught that homosexuality is a valid alternate lifestyle which they could begin considering even while they're in their preteen years. This is an insane thing, and you never hear a homosexual activist say, "You know, we homosexual activists, let's not be too successful, because we're not having babies. We need enough straight people to have babies who grow up to be policemen to protect us from thugs, don't we? We need enough straight people to have babies who grow up to be doctors, because we're not going to have any babies that are going to be doctors and policemen and plumbers and electricians. So let's not be too successful." Do they ever say that? No. It's as if their agenda could be carried to the max, and somehow there'd still be doctors, there'd still be nurses, there'd still be taxpayers, there'd still be soldiers to protect our borders. It is an absolute, utter insanity, and they don't even know it. And the media is not proclaiming it as such. This is the chaotic world we live in. You look around, you think, oh, society is so ordered. There are forces of chaos right at work, right under our feet, right under our noses. What is the hope? People who understand this and who understand some basic logic as well. But what are some of these things in the Quran? I've talked about it stylistically. What about its content? The Quran repeatedly urges Muslims to spread Islam with violence. Muhammad taught that all of mankind is divided into two houses, the house of Islam and the house of war. The word Islam means submission. The house of submission, meaning submission to Muhammad as a prophet, submission to the Quran, submission to Islamic rulers. And the other is the Dar al-Harb, the house of war. So by definition, if you're not a Muslim, you are a standing enemy in perpetuity, unless you totally submit to becoming a dhimmi. And dhimmis, according to Sharia law, cannot repair their houses, cannot repair their churches, cannot repair their synagogues. Dhimmis cannot even ride a horse on horseback. You have to ride bareback. I mean, Sharia law is full of discriminating things like that. And here are people in England, like the Archbishop of Canterbury, saying Sharia law is inevitable for England. Oh, little does he know. There's a Western civilization, is sinking in a quicksand of naivete. Our leaders are blasé, naive. Our educational system is off its rocker, and it's up to us. And if the Lord tarries, I think the day will come when our secular fellow citizens, seeing what's coming on the earth, will point their fingers at us and say, you're religious people, you should have seen what was coming. Why didn't you warn us? All of this, and in the midst of it all, who do we still have to show love for? Muslims. Wow, is that a challenge? Yes. Can the Holy Spirit enable us?
Yes.
For both. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Men and women, oh, I hope you're taking it to heart. And I hope you'll talk to other people about it. It is so essential. Things are happening in the world. And if we become spokespersons for Scripture and for ordinary human logic, which is being abused, you know, they say, you got to have an open mind. Well, get your mind too open, logic falls out. So, what else can I say? Lots. Now, if you talk with a Muslim friend about the war verses in the Quran, and I told you there's 109, they're not going to tell you that, but that's how many there are. They will say, but there are peace verses in the Quran. We go by the peace verses. And they're right. There are 6 peace verses in the Quran. And let me quote a couple of them for you. One of the peace verses is, there's no compulsion in religion. Which sounds like, if you're not a Muslim, you're never going to be forced to convert. Or, if you are a Muslim and decide you want to leave Islam, you're free to leave without being killed as a apostate. Oh, yeah, that's a peace verse. Here's another one. Muhammad said to his followers, if you have difficulty understanding the verses Allah is giving to me for you, ask Jews and Christians to help you understand, because they are people of the book, meaning people of the Bible. So he's telling Muslims to consult with people like us to help them understand the Quran. Well, guess it's nice he said that. Wait a minute though, there's problems, but I'll mention the problems later. Another peace verse is one that President George W. Bush quoted to the American public on Remembrance Day, Carol, was it? November 11th? Veterans Day. Veterans Day 3 years ago, because George Bush was saying after 9/11, Islam is a peaceful religion. It's a great religion. It's just been hijacked by a few radicals, but it's not the fault of Islam that all these attacks are happening and tall buildings being destroyed with hijacked jets. Islam is okay. And apparently the word was getting back to him. A lot of Americans don't believe what you're saying. So he decided on his Veterans Day address he had to bolster what he'd been saying. So he's got dozens of Saudi friends in Saudi Arabia, in Washington, D.C. He apparently went to one of them and said, please, please give me a peace verse from the Quran so I can quote it to reassure the American public. So somebody gave him a peace verse, and he quoted it, and here it is. He who slays one man, it's as if he slew all of mankind. He who spares one human life, it's as if he spared all of mankind. George Bush quoted that. Something Muhammad said that is obviously opposed to killing even one person. One person is precious. To kill one person, it's as if you killed the whole human race. It's a horrible crime. Don't do it, don't do it. Spare a human life, it's as if you spared all of mankind. Wow. Islam must be okay after all, if Muhammad said that. There's a problem. He recited those 6 peace verses while he was still in Mecca, when he was still naively anticipating that eventually, when he went to Medina and won the affirmation of Jews and hopefully Christians also, they would acknowledge him as a prophet. And as long as he entertained that hope, he was saying nice things about us. Muslim theologians say those 6 peace verses are only from the Mecca period, the early period of his life, and they are abrogated from the war verses that God gave Muhammad in the later Medina period of his life. So, Muslim theologians regard those 6 peace verses as abrogated by the 109 war verses. Abrogation, you know what abrogation means? Something good is replaced by something better. It doesn't mean something bad is replaced by something good, but something good is replaced by something better. Like a married woman, when she uses her husband's surname replaces, abrogates her maiden name. Doesn't mean her maiden name was a bad name, but for this later period of life, this is a better surname for her. She might have been Abigail Smith as a young girl. As a married woman, she's Abigail Adams. The name Adams abrogates the name Smith. So the Muslim teaching is, if Jews and Christians had honored Muhammad as a prophet the way they were supposed to, the 6 peace verses from the Mecca period would not be abrogated. But because they rejected Muhammad's claim, the war verses replaced the peace verses. So when a Muslim gave President George Bush that peace verse, and he knew he was giving the President of the United States of America an abrogated verse. And they quote those verses purposefully as an attempt to deceive, to lull us into complacency while they are pressing forward with their radical goals. It's just like in the Old Testament. Do you find war verses in the first half of the Old Testament? Was Solomon authorized to kill every single Canaanite, man, woman, and child in the city of Ai? And they're all supposed to be killed in other cities as well? Was that, who did I say? Solomon. The very one, okay. Joshua. And did Elijah have God's permission to slay the prophets of Baal? Yes. There are war verses in the Psalms. And Muslims will say, you have war verses in your Bible, why can't we have them in our Koran? How are you going to respond to that? Well, guess what? 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 7 and 8 is where David, knowing that God wanted the temple built in Jerusalem, pleaded with God to be the one who would build the house of God. How did God respond to David's request? You and I would think David's a man after God's own heart. Surely God will say, David, you're the man, build my temple. What did God say instead? You have fought many wars in my sight. You have much blood on your hands. You will not build my house. Your son Solomon will be a man of peace. He will build my house. That is the beginning of an abrogation in the Bible. What is being abrogated? The use of the sword as a means of serving God. Okay? That is where God began to institute something different. And if you ask, well, why was it all right earlier? Why did it suddenly not become all right? Well, we'll have to wait till we get to heaven to get a full explanation from God, but if you want to hear my theory, pro tem, I will say apparently God knew that in those earlier ages, what is called the late Bronze Age, it was just not possible that early stage of the development of Israel to institute 2 distinctly different categories of government. Whatever had to be done by one form of government. So if a battle had to be fought, it's Moses authorizes it, Joshua carries it out. But God was clearly working toward a time when it would be possible to separate a secular, civic category of government from a religious, spiritual one, where there would be kings and generals here, but prophets and teachers here, and they would not, their purposes would not cross each other. Apparently that was an ideal, and it took a while to reach a place where that ideal could be instituted. Well, Maybe I'm wrong about that, but if you got a better theory, pose it. Okay. We see that from the time of King Solomon on, you do not find any war verses in the Bible. Look at Lamentations. Look at Isaiah. Look at Jeremiah. Look at Ezekiel. Nowhere in all those major and minor prophets, including the Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, war verses aren't there. And, you know, I didn't notice that at first. When it says in the New Testament, the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ, I thought it was only with the New Testament that the use of the sword as a means of serving the God of Israel was abrogated, replaced by an obligation to use only spiritual weapons in spiritual warfare, and no longer actual shedding of human blood. And then I realized it began earlier than that, right in the middle of the Old Testament scripture. So there is abrogation in the Bible and abrogation in the Koran, that is in the opposite direction. Yes. In the Quran, the peace verses are abrogated by war verses. In the Bible, the earlier war verses are abrogated by peace verses. The opposite thing. All right, so are you learning things? You're going to put what you're learning to use. You're going to be teachers. I'm only one voice, and there's maybe a few other voices like mine, but we got to have thousands of people. Secrets of the Quran has just been newly published in Korean. So you Koreans, if you go back, maybe you can use it as a basis to warn Korea, because South Korea is being invaded by Islam. Every nation on earth is in the process of being invaded by massive numbers of Muslims. And they see it as two things that Muslims are being taught is Allah's special privilege for Islam. First, Allah is giving all of Western civilization, which they call Christian civilization, a spirit of blindness about having babies, a disinterest in having babies. It's from Allah, because He wants us to diminish our numbers, and He's allowing our legal systems to make abortion illegal, because Allah wants us to push ourselves toward extinction, so it'll be easier for His people, the Muslims, to take over without too much resistance from us. You know, when I see a president so in favor of abortion, and he's got background ties with Islam, and he bows before the king of Saudi Arabia, I'm wondering, is he favoring abortion because he knows it's in Islam's ultimate interest? I do have some suspicions about him. And there's other things too. But anyway, Muslims are also asking a rhetorical question. Why did Allah hide most of the world's oil wealth under the sands of Muslim nations? It's because He foresaw that Islam was going to need an enormous amount of wealth to sweep aside this massive heresy called Christianity, and to erase Judaism from the face of the earth and allow Islam to prevail everywhere. It is Allah's provision for the ultimate victory of Islam to subdue the whole earth and reduce anyone who doesn't become a Muslim to the state of dhimmitude, to be a dhimmi, totally subordinate to Sharia law, no matter what. So that's how they're interpreting history. And until recently, the Saudi royal family in Saudi Arabia was squandering hundreds of billions of dollars of oil wealth for what purpose? Purchasing specially outfitted 747 jets for shopping trips to London and Paris, and gambling trips to Monaco and Las Vegas, purchasing golf courses in Florida and racetracks in New York State for their own wealth and enjoyment and enrichment. And the radical Wahhabi mullahs in Saudi Arabia were watching this with total indignation. Say the word Wahhabi. It's spelled W-A-H-H-A-B-I. Wahhabi clerics, most of them in Saudi Arabia, follow the teachings of Wahhab a mullah who lived back in the 1700s, who said the reason Islam is losing ground vis-a-vis the expansion of Christian civilization is because we Muslims have given up on jihad. We've stopped engaging in holy war. When we first burst out of the Arabian Peninsula wielding the scimitar, we quickly overran all of Christian North Africa and Christian Spain and Portugal and Christian Asia Minor, where the Apostle Paul and Barnabas planted churches. And we expanded so rapidly. I mean, the Battle of Tours, way up there in northern France, was just 100 years after the death of Muhammad. That's a pretty rapid expansion in 1 century, wasn't it? Then we got tired of Islam. We gave up on Islam. We backed away from it, from jihad. And as a result, Christian civilization is outpacing us, and we have got to get back to jihad. So he began to call for a return to the ideal of holy war, the use of violence. He also was not only utterly hateful toward infidels, Jews and Christians, he also despised those inferior Muslims called the Shia. He was a Sunni, and Sunni Islam was the only right Islam. So he personally led an army in what is now called Iraq and slaughtered 12,000 Shia Muslims. So he was violent. And he helped the House of Saud gain control in Saudi Arabia. And that is where his sermons have been preserved. And the Wahhabis are the most radical Muslims on the whole Sunni side of Islam. And they're entrenched in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and other places nearby. And they were appalled to see the Saudi family squandering hundreds of billions of dollars of oil wealth foolishly. They said, Allah has given that money for the expansion of true Islam, and you are squandering it. So they began preaching against the Saudis in mosques all through that heartland of Islam, and managed to turn the population against the Saudi royal family. And the Saudi royal family has become aware that if the Wahhabi clerics would give the word, they'd all have their throats slit in one night. So they've got together, recognizing the reality that Saudi Arabia really should now be renamed Wahhabi Arabia, and that they found out that actually the Wahhabis didn't want to slit their throats. They wanted to strike a deal with them. And here's the deal. We actually need you to be a political front for us. And if you'll agree to be a political front for us, we will spare your lives. Western presidents, prime ministers, secretaries of state wouldn't know how to talk to clerics like us, and we don't want to talk to them. But they know you. So you be the ones that interact with all those Western bigwigs. But here's the other side of the deal. You're going to stop squandering those hundreds of billions of dollars of oil money the way you've been doing. You're going to turn the massive amount of oil money over to us, and we're going to use it for Allah's purposes, not for personal greed. So the Wahhabis have control of an enormous amount of wealth, and they're using it to open tens of thousands of radical Muslim schools called madrasas. Please say madrasa. Madrasa schools are schools designed to indoctrinate little Muslim boys beginning at 5, 6, 7, 8 years of age to vehemently hate Christianity, hate Judaism, hate democracy, hate everything infidel, and see everything as to be under Muslim control. They're being bred in tens of thousands of madrasas worldwide as a plague of human locusts, prepared to come at the rest of the world viciously in years to come. Wherever demographics will be sufficient, they won't need to throw their lives away as suicide bombers, but failing that, these millions of graduates of tens of thousands of madrasa schools are ready for war. I talked with a U.S. serviceman who'd come back from serving in Afghanistan. He said, every time You know, we find out when are the madrasas in Afghanistan going to graduate their latest senior class. We find out and we prepare for violence because they come out just raring to try to kill us. In Secrets of the Quran, I quote from a member of the Indonesian Department of Education. He said, we already have 37,000 madrasas in Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim nation. And only 7.3% of them are willing to accept anything from the Indonesian Department of Education. The radical mullahs and all said, we don't need your stuff. We know what we want to teach our Muslim boys. And these millions of Muslim boys are memorizing the entire Quran in Arabic, even though they don't speak Arabic in Indonesia. Even if they're in some other Muslim nation where Urdu is the language, these Muslim boys learn the Quran, memorize the Quran in Arabic. And you and I would think it's a waste of the students' time, it's a waste of the instructor's time to have children memorize a book in a language they don't know. But it actually suits their purpose because they're memorizing something in Arabic, which they don't know. They don't get to be bored by the repetition. They don't see all the bad grammar and mistakes because they don't know. It's not their language. If it was in their language, they'd say, this is bad grammar. But also it gives the instructors another advantage. They get to choose which of the 6,200 verses they get to interpret into the language those little boys do understand. So, if they interpret for them into Indonesian, Urdu, Farsi, whatever, the war verses, what impression does that give these little fellas about all the other verses they don't know? You can guess. When these little boys get to be teenage boys and their hormones are starting to stir, the sex drive is awakening. That is when the Muslim mullahs interpret for them into the language they do know the 5 verses in the Quran and the dozens of similar verses in the Hadith that promise sexual enjoyment in heaven with beautiful dark-eyed virgins, especially for Muslims who get themselves killed as martyrs in holy war. 5 verses in the Quran promise that. One verse even says, because apparently when Muhammad was teaching to those who were, he wanted these men to help him maraud caravans from Mecca, and they said, well, the more you maraud those caravans, the better guarded they are. What if an arrow finds its mark? I'm dead, I don't get to share in any of the 80% of the plunder you divide up among your followers. Muhammad said, oh, if you are killed in jihad, you're guaranteed immediate access to paradise. And you'll have all the wealth you could have, and because you are killed as a martyr in jihad, you're going to have virgins, beautiful dark-eyed virgins, for your pleasure. And some of the Muslims, some of the men apparently said, well, they're virgins now, but what if a lot of other guys get there before I do? They won't be virgins. Muhammad said in one of the 5 verses in the Quran, Allah keeps them ever virgin, promising perpetual virginity for these virgins up in heaven. And so they take that seriously. So these little boys, their sex drive is awakening, and all they can do is fantasize about getting killed in some kind of jihad, going into heaven, and having all those beautiful virgins at their beck and call. Muhammad actually took the male sex drive and exploited it as an inducement for raunchy pagan men to become Muslims. Even though they might not have had any religious inclination at all, that's how they got brought in and then were indoctrinated. And then the Hadith. I was told that I could stop at 12:45. That's why I didn't stop at 12:30. I see the clock. Maybe they didn't tell you, but they told me. But I'm going to stop a little before that even. I do want to tell you, because I was not skimming, reading through the Quran like I think some other researchers have done, I found things that I'm quite sure they overlooked. Chapter 24, verse 33 is a paragraph-length verse. And when you see a really long verse in the Quran, get suspicious. It's because there's something at the end of it they don't want you to pay attention to, unless you're a Muslim. It's like this is the buffer that bores you, so you'll skim and miss the really awful thing that's there. Because a lot of verses are just real brief, but then they have these long ones, and I kept finding at the end of a really long verse something atrocious. Here's an example. I'm just quoting the second half of this verse, chapter 24, verse 33. It begins with Muhammad, the second half begins, that is, with Muhammad saying something moralistic, because he's claimed to be a prophet, apparently had an idea, prophets are supposed to teach morality, you know, so I guess I got to say something moralistic. What shall I say morally? Oh, here's something. So he says, and I quote, "Do not compel your female slaves to be prostitutes to increase your wealth." Okay, so is that a moralistic statement? Hey, 4 other verses authorize Muslim men to have female slaves because they're given by God, and authorize them to take the female slaves to your bed. So Muslim men are authorized to own any number of female slaves they can possibly accumulate and have sex with all of them, in addition to their wives. That is authorized in the Quran. Polygamy is authorized, but also sex with female slaves is authorized. And in this verse, he seems to be saying, but do not force a female slave to be a prostitute. That is going too far. But guess what? There's 2 sides to his personality, and they're at war with each other, and which one ultimately prevails? The evil side, again and again. After he's placed that restriction on Muslim men, it's apparently he's thinking, do I really want to say that? I don't think I do. No, we got to change this. Let's qualify this. So right after what I quoted, he says, if they care about chastity. So that's a backing away, isn't it? He says, do not compel your female slaves to be prostitutes to increase your wealth. And then he says, wait a minute, let's indicate when it would be okay. If they care about chastity, you can't do it, but otherwise it's okay. So a Muslim man is authorized by that verse to take a poll of his female slaves. Do you want to be a chaste woman? You do? Okay, I can't use you. You've already lost your chastity, so I can make you a prostitute. Here, you're going to be a prostitute. I'm not saying that any Muslim man anywhere in the world uses that verse as an excuse to do what it allows. I'm just quoting the verse because it is there, and it shows the character of Muhammad. I hope there's no Muslim man anywhere that knows about that verse and is using it as an excuse to run a brothel. But he could. The verse is there. And it gets worse. I haven't finished quoting it yet. It gets worse. Brace yourselves. The verse ends with this, but if you do compel them, meaning what? Against their will, to be prostitutes, Allah is forgiving and merciful. So it ends up with permission, with a promise of forgiveness of God. Because they're only women, they're only slaves, it doesn't matter. If Jesus said that to his disciples and it was recorded in the New Testament, do you think the media would make sure the whole world knew it? Oh yes. Well, Muhammad said that and is getting a free pass as a prophet. The media is not functioning. It is ignoring. It is not doing its research. It is not digging in. Our educational system, likewise. Educators want to educate people at university level about Quran. What do? They buy a book from a Muslim apologist and regurgitate it and think they're really representing Islam properly. It's whitewash. It's sugar-coated. It's not accurate. But you know, you're learning. So, one last thing from the hadith. In the hadith, 2 Muslim men came to Muhammad for confession of sin. And you and I would think, oh, just like Catholics go to the priest for confession. No, 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 wait, this is different. They said, O Messenger of Allah, we kidnapped 2 women and we raped them. So you and I think, oh, they're sorry they kidnapped those 2 women. They're sorry they raped them. They're asking for forgiveness for 2 horrible crimes. That's not it. They went on to explain to Muhammad the particular way they raped those 2 women. It wasn't the ordinary way. They practiced what is called coitus interruptus because they were hoping not to impregnate them. And after they did it that way, They thought, oh, we didn't even think maybe raping a woman that way is a mortal offense and we're going to go to hell because of, not because we kidnapped them, that's okay, not because we raped them, that's okay, but because of the way we raped them, maybe that's a mortal sin and we're doomed. So they asked Muhammad, is it all right that we rape the women that way? What should he have said?
Don't rape them under any circumstances.
Don't kidnap them, don't rape them in any way. You don't understand. You are, I mean, he had people killed at his word. Could have had them slain, cut off their heads because they were horrible criminals. But anyway, the hadith quotes Muhammad as saying, it doesn't offend Allah if you do it that way. Because anyone he wants to exist will come to exist even if you've practiced coitus interruptus. So there was no rebuke. That is in the hadith. And Muslim men who are perhaps already radicalized by the war verses are encouraged by things like that to think in terms of sexual immorality authorized by God as part of a service to Allah. Men and women, this is far worse than Roman paganism. This is far worse than communism. This is far worse than Nazism even. The Koran is like Hitler's Mein Kampf merged with Karl Marx's Das Kapital into one book with a claim of divine inspiration added and billions of dollars of oil money to carry out its goals. Do we have a problem? We do. Mein Kampf filled with hatred against Jews and implied against Christians too, because other letters from Adolf Hitler that have been found show he was even more anti-Christian than he was anti-Jewish, but he just said less about it because there's so many more Christians than Jews. But are you glad Adolf Hitler did not claim divine inspiration for Mein Kampf? Are you glad Karl Marx didn't claim divine inspiration for Das Kapital? If they had claimed divine inspiration, that would have made Nazis even more vehemently zealous to implement Hitler's horrible goals. And likewise, communists, if they thought Das Kapital was inspired by God, that would have added divine authorization for communist attempt to control the world. But in the Quran, it's just as hate-mongering as Mein Kampf and just as inspiring for political domination of the world as Das Kapital, merged into one book with a claim of divine inspiration added and billions of dollars of oil money available to be put to work for those purposes. Okay. Am I saying all these things to make you afraid? No. Am I saying these things to make you concerned? Yes. I close quoting what the Apostle Paul said to Timothy. God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. God bless you. Thank you.